In the autumn of 1944, Auschwitz was no longer the same camp that the Nazis had built in 1940. The Eastern Front was approaching. The distant sound of Soviet artillery could be heard on some clear nights. In Berlin, Himmler and other leaders knew that the complex was doomed. Even so, the machinery of deportation and murder continued operating until the beginning of 1945. Inside the camp, the SS medical service was still active. Under the authority of Chief Physician Edward Wirths, a group of nearly 20 doctors controlled the infirmaries, the selections on the ramp, and the so-called experiments, which, in practice, were methods of murder. Among them were Josef Mengele, Karl Klauberg, Johann Paul Kremer, Hans Munch, and others less known who shared the same structure of power. As the Red Army approached, the priority of the SS command was to erase traces. Documents were destroyed, files were burned, and key installations were evacuated. In Birkenau, part of the gas chambers and crematoria had already been blown up months earlier to hide evidence. For the SS doctors, the order was clear. They had to continue attending the troops and, at the same time, prepare their own withdrawal. On January 17, 1945, the massive evacuation began. Thousands of prisoners were forced to march westward in the so-called death marches. The SS medical personnel participated in that operation. Some doctors accompanied columns of prisoners. Others remained until the last moment in the infirmary blocks or in the SS infirmary, where medical material and documentation were concentrated. Not everyone received the withdrawal in the same way. Edward Wirths, who had served since 1942 as the camp's chief physician, was transferred with part of the staff to Mittelbau Dora, another camp where slave labor was also exploited under extreme conditions. He remained the medical authority of a system of camps that was collapsing, but he retained his rank and authority. Other doctors chose to disappear in the chaos. Josef Mengele left Auschwitz with the retreat, still as an SS officer, but his objective was no longer to serve the Reich, but to save himself. First, he blended with retreating units. Later, when the war was approaching its end, he began to prepare a new identity. In his official papers, his name would soon cease to appear. Meanwhile, inside the camp, the sanitary situation became even more chaotic. Many sick prisoners or those too weak were abandoned. The decision of who marched and who stayed depended on SS orders, but also on the doctors who certified who was fit to evacuate and who would remain behind, often to die. That final phase created ambiguous situations that would later be used in trials, both in defense and in accusation. On January 27, 1945, the Red Army liberated the complex. It found a few thousand survivors, warehouses full of stolen belongings and remains of installations destroyed in great haste. Among those captured in the perimeter were SS personnel who had not managed to escape. Some guards, non-commissioned officers and administrative staff fell prisoner. Very few Auschwitz doctors were still there. Most had managed to leave with the retreating columns or had been relocated to other camps. In the following days, Soviet forces began to interrogate prisoners and the few captured SS members. Testimonies coincided in describing the almost constant presence of doctors in the selections on the ramp and in the blocks where experiments were carried out. Names such as Mengele, Klauberg or Kremer appeared again and again. However, the Soviets did not yet have a complete list of who was who. The map of responsibilities was barely outlined. In the rest of occupied Europe, the collapse of the Reich multiplied scenes of surrender. On the Western Front, Waffen-SS units surrendered to the British or Americans. Among the prisoners were medical officers who had previously served in Auschwitz or in other camps. At first, many were not separated from the rest. They were interrogated in a general manner and their records remained buried in piles of forms without deep investigation. The personal situation of those doctors was very different. Some, like Wirths, surrendered under their real names. They trusted in presenting themselves as military doctors who had followed orders. In September 1945, when his past in Auschwitz began to come to light during interrogations in the British zone, Wirths committed suicide in the prison of Staumüller before facing trial. His death prevented any public examination of his role as chief physician of the largest extermination complex of Nazism. Others tried to construct a different story from the first day. They searched for witnesses among the prisoners who could speak well of them. They presented their work in the camp as a form of help within a brutal system that, according to them, they did not control. Hans Munch would be the most well-known case of this type of strategy. He ended up being considered by some courts as an exception among the doctors of Auschwitz. That category, the good doctor in an extermination camp, would have important consequences in his life after 1945. At the same time, in the administrative ruins of the Reich, documents began to appear that mentioned names, positions, and destinations. Personal diaries, such as that of Johann Paul Kramer, fell into Allied hands and showed the detailed participation of a university professor in selections and special actions. That mixture of scattered papers and testimonies of survivors would become the basis of the first criminal proceedings against doctors from the camps. Arrests, interrogations, and the first map of responsibilities. In 1945 and 1946, the legal priority focused on the major political and military leaders. The Nuremberg Trials were organized. There, new concepts were defined: crimes against humanity, genocide, individual responsibility within a state apparatus. Doctors appeared as a specific group only later in one of the subsequent proceedings, the so-called Doctors' Trial. That process focused mainly on the euthanasia program and on experiments in other camps. Auschwitz was present, but it was not the only focus. In parallel, Poland prepared its own cases. The territory where the complex was located had been liberated by the Red Army and came under Polish control. Warsaw considered that what had happened there was a crime against the state and against Polish citizens, and deported Jews. For that reason, in 1947, the major trial against the camp personnel took place, the so-called Auschwitz trial in Krakow. Among the accused were doctors, pharmacists, nurses, and SS medical personnel. The previous interrogations had gathered very precise testimonies. Many survivors knew the name and face of those who carried out selections on the ramp or supervised executions with phenol. Polish prosecutors cross-checked that information with documents found in the camp and in SS offices. That was how cases such as that of Johann Paul Kramer emerged from academic anonymity and reached the dock. Kramer was not an ordinary troop doctor. He was a university professor of anatomy. He had taken leave from his chair to serve as an SS doctor in Auschwitz in 1942. During his stay, he kept a personal diary. He wrote about selections, special actions, and executions by injection. He used an apparently technical language. At the same time, he noted impressions about the food, the weather, and his intellectual life. That notebook, recovered after the war, became direct evidence of his participation in murders. At the Krakow trial, the prosecutors read him phrases from his own diary. Kramer tried to minimize his responsibility. He said that he had exaggerated. He maintained that he had not had real power over life and death decisions. But the testimonies of prisoners linked him with selections of the sick and with frequent presence in the crematoria. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. The penalty was later commuted to imprisonment. He served years of sentence in Poland and was later handed over to Germany, where he lived in freedom until the end of his life. The path of Hans Munch was very different. He was also a doctor at Auschwitz. He had worked in the so-called hygiene laboratory. He participated in research on typhus and other contagious diseases. He was present at selections, at least as an observer. However, during the Krakow trial, several survivors testified in his favor. They said that he had refused to participate actively in the gassing of prisoners, that he had tried to save lives in specific situations. Munch built his defense on that image. He presented himself as a man trapped in a criminal system who had tried to limit the damage. He emphasized that he had never signed execution orders nor carried out lethal experiments. The statements of certain witnesses reinforced that account. In a complex political and judicial context, the court accepted that version. He was acquitted. He returned to Germany and resumed his civilian life. These two cases show the range of fates that camp doctors could have in the first post-war years. Some were identified with direct evidence and condemned severely. Others managed to present themselves as exceptions, as professionals who had preserved a remnant of conscience in the midst of organized crime. That narrative, that of the different doctor, would later be exploited by other accused. However, the number of doctors prosecuted in those first trials was limited. The medical personnel who had passed through Auschwitz was much larger. Not everything was documented. The war had destroyed archives. Many personal files had been lost. In addition, the Allies and the new Polish authorities had immediate political priorities: rebuilding the state, managing millions of displaced people, initiating other cases against police, guards, and civilian officials. Outside Poland, the situation was even more lax. In the occupied Western Zone, many doctors who had served in camps were interned, interrogated in a general manner, and then released with the label of minor collaborators. The denazification forms were often based on self-declarations. If there was no concrete accusation or a document linking them to crimes, they could present themselves as simple military doctors. That gap was an opportunity for those who knew what to keep silent. At the same time, the different powers did not coordinate their information well. A doctor who had been captured on the Western Front might previously have worked in Auschwitz without British or American interrogators having the details. Poland and the Soviet Union accumulated evidence but did not always share it. That documentary fragmentation allowed many biographies to remain incomplete. The names that appeared in one testimony were not cross-checked with a prisoner record in another occupation zone. Soviet files, prisons, and the return of Klauberg. When the war ended, not all the doctors of Auschwitz fell into Western hands. An important part fell into the Soviet orbit. For them, the map of the post-war period was different. They did not pass through denazification forms or administrative filters. They were taken to prisons, NKVD interrogations, and in some cases to rapid trials before military tribunals. The Soviet Union created a network of special camps in its occupation zone in Germany. These were the so-called Speziallager, managed by the NKVD. There they imprisoned former Nazi officials, Wehrmacht officers, members of the SS, and also medical personnel. Many remained detained for years without trial while the Soviets classified files and decided whom to take to the USSR for exemplary proceedings. Among the Auschwitz doctors captured by the Red Army, one name stood out: Karl Klauberg. Before the war, he was a well-known gynecologist in Germany, a specialist in fertility, a professor, author of scientific works, head of a clinic in Upper Silesia. That professional reputation was one of the reasons why Himmler chose him to search for a method of mass sterilization that was simple and cheap. That task took him to Auschwitz and later to Ravensbrück. In Birkenau, Klauberg used Jewish and Romani women as laboratory material. He injected caustic substances into the fallopian tubes to produce scarring and permanent blockage. Many victims died from infections or sepsis. Others were left with chronic pain and infertility for life. The objective was to design a method that would allow the sterilization of thousands of women considered undesirable without resorting to complicated surgery. When the front collapsed, Klauberg left the camp. He did not manage to reach the West. He ended up in territory occupied by the Red Army. The Soviets identified him as an SS doctor. They arrested him and transferred him to the USSR. There he was interrogated for his participation in crimes against Soviet citizens deported to concentration camps. The initial focus was not the abstract concept of genocide. It was the death and mutilation of people who in many cases held Soviet nationality. In 1948, Klauberg was tried in the Soviet Union. Sources indicate that the process focused on his sterilization experiments and on direct responsibility for the death of hundreds of women. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison for war crimes and crimes against Soviet citizens. That figure placed him, in theory, among the major criminals who were supposed to spend decades in the Soviet penitentiary system. His life then became tied to the world of special camps and penal colonies. Conditions in those installations were harsh: overcrowding, poor food, forced labor, disease. They were not designed for rapid re-education. They were spaces of punishment and political control. Their former Nazis coincided with real or supposed opponents of the Soviet regime. For almost a decade, Klauberg's fate left barely any public trace. He did not appear in the first major accounts of the Nuremberg Trials. In Germany, many believed he was dead. For the victims, his name remained associated above all with direct memory. Women who had passed through Block 10 remembered the injections, the pain and the scars, but they did not know where the doctor who directed those procedures was. The situation changed in the mid-1950s. In 1955, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated with the USSR the repatriation of the last German prisoners of war and several individuals convicted of war crimes. It was an important political gesture. It allowed the Federal Republic to present itself as the protector of its citizens, even those with a compromised past. Within those agreements, Klauberg was included. The man who had received 25 years in prison was released after only 7. When he returned to West Germany, he found a society that wanted to look forward. The political climate favored reintegration. People spoke of closing chapters, of not keeping the wounds of the war permanently open. Many former SS members resumed their professions. In that context, Klauberg benefited from his former scientific prestige. He was reinstated in his former clinic and once again began presenting himself as a specialist in fertility problems. His strategy was not discretion. On the contrary, later testimonies indicate that he spoke with pride about his research work in Auschwitz. He boasted of having developed an innovative sterilization method. He even publicly offered services to reverse sterilizations, as if he could correct the damage he himself had caused in the 1940s. That behavior attracted the attention of colleagues, patients, and journalists. News of his return also reached the victims. Some of the women who had suffered his experiments were still alive, in Israel and in other countries. Survivor organizations began to investigate. They collected testimonies. They sent letters to German authorities. They pointed out the paradox. A man who had been convicted in the USSR of war crimes was practicing medicine freely in the Federal Republic without his past having been thoroughly reviewed by the German justice system. The pressure had an effect. In 1955, the same year of his return, Klauberg was arrested by the German police. The prosecution opened an investigation for murder and serious bodily injury in hundreds of cases. The task began of reconstructing his acts in Auschwitz, this time from a German jurisdiction. Former prisoners had to be located, documents reviewed, materials coming from the USSR and Poland translated. It was the beginning of a process that could have become an emblematic trial about Nazi medicine. That trial never took place. In August 1957, Klauberg died in the prison of Kiel, officially from a heart problem, before the oral proceedings began. His death closed the criminal path. There was no German sentence that examined his responsibility in detail. What remained were fragments: the Soviet conviction, the investigative files in Germany, the statements of his victims, and the memory of his brief reopening of a medical practice in the post-war period. Klauberg's trajectory illustrates several key elements: the initial harshness of some Soviet trials, the political use of prisoners of war in diplomatic negotiations, and the ease with which, in the Federal Republic, a doctor with a criminal past could recover his position until social pressure prevented it. It also shows the fragility of memory when judicial processes remain unfinished. Meanwhile, other Auschwitz doctors who had passed through Soviet hands followed different paths. Some died in the special camps, others returned years later and integrated into civilian life without the noise that accompanied the Klauberg case. Taken together, those trajectories show that the purge was not uniform. It depended on political decisions, diplomatic exchanges, and the chance of who fell into which occupation zone. Quiet life in the Federal Republic, offices, clinics, and oblivion. In the Federal Republic of Germany, the post-war period began with ruins, hunger, and a state that did not yet exist. In that landscape, an immediate need appeared. Doctors were needed. Hospitals had to function. It was necessary to rebuild a minimal health system for a devastated population. That vacuum opened a door to many professionals with a Nazi past, including former camp doctors. The formal process to deal with them was denazification. Millions of Germans had to fill out questionnaires. They declared their membership in the party and in organizations of the regime. They were classified into categories: major offenders, incriminated, compromised, followers, exonerated. In theory, the most involved were supposed to be removed from public life. In practice, the denazification tribunals were overwhelmed. There were too many files, too many biographies to review. And there was clear political pressure. Officials, judges, police officers, and doctors had to be recovered quickly in order to set the country in motion. In that context, many doctors who had served in Auschwitz presented themselves as specialists without a relevant past. They emphasized their university degrees, their experience in military hospitals, and omitted details about selections or experiments in camps. If there was no specific dossier against them, nor a concrete accusation, it was easy for them to be classified as simple sympathizers or passive followers. That allowed them to return to practice after a brief suspension, or even without any real sanction. The case of Hans Munch illustrates this dynamic well. He had worked in Auschwitz as a doctor at the SS Hygiene Institute. He was in the camp from 1943. He saw selections. He knew how the gas chambers functioned. He participated in research on typhus and other infectious diseases. However, in the Krakow trial of 1947, he was acquitted, in part due to testimonies of prisoners who stated that he had tried to prevent executions and had refused to participate directly in gassings. That acquittal was decisive. Back in Germany, Munch had no major obstacles to integration. He settled in Bavaria and opened a practice as a general physician. He treated families, diagnosed common illnesses, signed prescriptions. His past in Auschwitz was reduced to a distant note that almost nobody wanted to revisit. In local memory, he was, above all, the village doctor, the man who visited the sick at home and who listened to patients in a modest waiting room. His was not an isolated case. Throughout the Federal Republic, former SS doctors recovered careers in private clinics, public hospitals, and universities. Some had worked in euthanasia programs or in other camps, not necessarily in Auschwitz. The professional structures of German medicine reabsorbed them. Medical associations, scientific societies, and faculties carried out few, deep purges. Often they limited themselves to changing names in the most visible leadership boards and leaving many chairs and departments intact. To understand why this happened, it is necessary to see the mentality of the profession in those years. Before and during Nazism, German doctors had considered themselves part of an enlightened elite. They had enthusiastically participated in racial policies, forced sterilizations, and programs to eliminate lives unworthy of living. After 1945, that same elite tended to interpret its conduct as an error of context, not as a structural crime. Many presented themselves as technicians who had followed orders, or as scientists who had worked under difficult conditions. Institutions reinforced that reading. Regional and national medical associations focused for years on rebuilding the reputation of the profession before the public. They spoke of scientific advances, new therapies, and the contribution of German medicine to the modernization of the country. Reflection on the role of doctors in genocide was postponed. It was not a central part of the corporate discourse in the 1950s and 1960s. In everyday life, this meant that a doctor who had passed through Auschwitz could direct a pediatric clinic, a chair of psychiatry, or a gynecology department without his patients knowing anything about his past. The secret was maintained by several layers of silence. Silence of colleagues who often knew the biography of their superiors and preferred not to question it. Silence of authorities who feared opening too many cases and paralyzing the health system. And silence of a society that was still dealing with rationing, refugees, and the Cold War. In that climate, some of those doctors built lives that, seen from the outside, appeared normal. Marriage, children, vacations, participation in local associations. There were even those who entered municipal or regional politics. The past in the SS was reduced to a biographical note mentioned only when strictly necessary. For many citizens of the Federal Republic, the idea that the trusted family doctor might have worked in an extermination camp was simply unimaginable. Over time, however, those biographies began to show cracks. Part of the younger generation, born after the war, began to ask questions. Medical students, historians, journalists, and activists became interested in the role of the profession during the Third Reich. They reviewed university archives. They examined lists of professors before and after 1945. They discovered striking continuities, the same names in chairs of pediatrics, psychiatry, or surgery. The same signatures in scientific articles published in the 1930s and in the 1950s. This late investigation revealed that the case of Munch as an exception had been used to soften the general image. The figure of the good doctor of Auschwitz allowed some Germans to think that within the system there had also been gestures of humanity and that, therefore, moral condemnation could be concentrated only on a few extreme individuals. But historical research demonstrated that the commitment of German medicine to Nazism had been broad, deep, and voluntary. It was not limited to well-known names. It encompassed entire networks of hospitals, institutes, and laboratories. While those debates emerged in academic spheres and activist circles, most of the Auschwitz doctors who had remained in the Federal Republic aged in relative tranquility. Their careers had reached retirement. Some died without ever being questioned again. Others appeared occasionally in the press when a local investigation unearthed a forgotten past. The idea that for decades they had attended consultations, prescribed medicines, and signed birth and death certificates without answering for their acts in the camp became a central ethical issue for German society. Meanwhile, another group followed a very different path. They did not work in German hospitals nor teach in universities. They hid in boarding houses, changed identities, and crossed oceans. The most extreme example of that clandestine route would be the most famous Auschwitz doctor of all, whose fate moved far away from the quiet streets of the Federal Republic and led him to a new life in South America. The emblematic fugitive, the clandestine life of Josef Mengele. When Auschwitz was evacuated, Mengele was still an SS medical officer. He ended the conflict in German territory, in the midst of columns of refugees and defeated units. He allowed himself to be captured by American troops under an incomplete identity. He did not reveal that he was a doctor from Auschwitz. He did not carry the classic SS mark on his arm. He did not appear on the first lists of major criminals. That allowed him to spend a few months in prisoner camps without being identified. By the end of 1945, he managed to leave that circuit. With the help of former comrades and support networks, he took refuge in Bavaria. There he began the deliberate construction of a new life. He changed his documentation, used papers in the names of dead soldiers, and avoided all contact with authorities. His family, which had a prosperous company in Günzburg, provided him with money, contacts, and later commercial cover. At the same time, the Allies were beginning to learn the scope of his crimes in Auschwitz, but they still did not associate them with the man hiding in southern Germany. From 1948 onward, the situation changed. Testimonies of survivors and documents from the camp made Mengele one of the most wanted names. His presence in the selections on the ramp, his experiments with twins, his lethal injections were already well documented. In Nuremberg and in other judicial forums, he was cited as an example of medicine turned into an instrument of murder. By then, he was already thinking about leaving Europe. He knew the net could close if someone recognized him in a tavern, at a station, or in a medical office. His exit door was the escape network later known as the Rat Lines. They were clandestine escape routes that connected monasteries, safe houses, and offices of officials willing to look the other way. They allowed hundreds of Nazis to travel to Italian ports and embark toward South America. In 1949, Mengele arrived in Argentina. He entered under a false identity using the name Helmut Gregor. The country was living under the government of Juan Domingo Perón, who had shown willingness to receive technicians and former German military men. In Buenos Aires, Mengele first settled in boarding houses and homes within the German-Argentine community. Over time, he moved to suburban areas such as Vicente López and later to localities such as San Fernando and the outskirts of Buenos Aires. Recent declassifications from the Archivo General de la Nación show that Argentine authorities eventually came to know who he really was, but for years they did not act. At the beginning of the 1950s, his life became less clandestine. He obtained an Argentine identity document with his real name. He opened businesses linked to agricultural machinery and pharmaceuticals. He traveled through the interior of the country, visited ranches, dealt with businessmen. He did not hide in a dark basement. He lived in middle-class neighborhoods and frequented cafes where German was spoken. Neighbors and acquaintances remember him as a reserved, polite man with no visible signs of an extraordinary past. Meanwhile, his notoriety was growing in Europe and Israel. Survivors of Auschwitz mentioned him in their testimonies. Journalists and Nazi hunters, such as Simon Wiesenthal, included him among the priority fugitives. In 1959, the federal German justice system issued an international arrest warrant against him, based on new investigations into his crimes. The warrant arrived in Buenos Aires accompanied by a formal extradition request. The reaction of Argentine authorities was ambiguous. Declassified documents indicate that they knew that the man settled on the outskirts of the capital was the former Auschwitz doctor. However, a judge rejected the extradition, arguing that it was motivated by political persecution. International pressure increased, and the circle of security around Mengele began to crack. He was warned that his arrest could be a matter of days or weeks. Faced with that risk, he decided to flee again. In 1959 or 1960, he crossed into Paraguay. where he obtained citizenship thanks to contacts in military circles and the support network of colonies of German origin. He remained there for a time, but the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires by the Mossad in 1960 sent a clear signal. No refuge in the region was completely safe. The next step was Brazil. In the mid-1960s, he settled in rural areas of the state of São Paulo, first on the property of a family of German origin, the Stammer, and later on another nearby farm linked to the Bossert. He used names such as Peter Hochbichler or Wolfgang Gerhard. He worked as a machinery merchant or as a kind of agricultural technician. His hosts knew, at least in part, who he was. The relationship mixed ideological affinity, economic dependence, and fear. The 1970s were marked by a double dynamic. On one hand, investigation teams in Israel, Germany, and the United States intensified the search. On the other, Mengele grew older with health problems and episodes of paranoia. According to the report of the United States Department of Justice, he feared being kidnapped like Eichmann. He avoided large cities, changed residence within the circle of friendly farms, always carried pills and false documents with him. His death came in an almost banal way. In February 1979, while swimming at the beach of Bertioga on the São Paulo coast, he suffered a stroke and drowned. He was buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard in a cemetery in Embu das Artes. For years, no one outside the small circle that protected him knew that the corpse belonged to the doctor of Auschwitz. The international hunt was still searching for a man who was already dead. In 1985, a joint investigation by Brazilian, German, Israeli, and American authorities led to the exhumation of the remains. Dental evidence and anthropometric analysis concluded that the body was that of Joseph Mengele. Later, genetic comparisons with relatives confirmed the identification. Today, his bones are kept at a university in São Paulo and are used in forensic medicine courses as study material on forensic identification. The other German mirror, the GDR, and the example of Horst Fischer. In the other half of Germany, the lives of many former Nazis followed a different path. The German Democratic Republic was founded in 1949 with a clear identity. It defined itself as an anti-fascist state. It presented Nazism as an exclusive product of Western capitalism. In that narrative, the main culprits lived on the other side of the wall. That did not mean that there were no hidden executioners in the East. It meant that for years the regime selected whom to pursue and when to do so. After the surrender, the Soviets purged part of the Nazi apparatus in their occupation zone. Many officials and police officers were detained, also some doctors. But as the Cold War advanced, the priority changed. The new state needed trained cadres. It needed doctors in towns, industrial cities, and rural districts. Just as in the West, that need allowed former SS members to integrate into normal life, as long as they were not overly visible figures. Horst Paul Sylvester Fischer fits this pattern. He had been an SS doctor in Auschwitz. He participated in selections on the Birkenau ramp. He chose who was sent to slave labor and who went directly to the gas chambers. Later investigations estimated that he selected tens of thousands of people for death. When the war ended, Fischer was not immediately identified. He removed the SS blood group tattoo from his arm to make recognition more difficult. He settled in the Eastern Zone. He changed some details of his biography. He did not present himself as a former camp doctor. He presented himself as a general physician with military experience. He obtained work in rural areas. He attended consultations, carried out health examinations, vaccinated children in schools and kindergartens. For his patients, he was simply the village doctor. For almost 20 years he lived like this. He married. He had children. He integrated into the social structure of the GDR. He attended official events, signed death certificates, participated in health campaigns. The state that proclaimed itself the heir of anti-fascism used, without knowing it or without wanting to recognize it, a man who had directed selections in the largest extermination center of Nazism. The contradiction was covered by silence and by the lack of coordination between archives in the East and the West. At the end of the 1950s, Fischer's name began to reappear in judicial files. In the Federal Republic, prosecutors investigating crimes in Auschwitz received lists of doctors who had worked in the camp. Among them was Horst Fischer. In 1960, a West German prosecutor's office issued an arrest warrant. They did not know that the man they were looking for was practicing freely in the other Germany. The turn came from within the GDR itself. The security services, the Stasi, discovered that a doctor in the country occasionally crossed the border into the West and spoke badly of the regime. When they investigated his case, they discovered something more: his record in the SS and his link to Auschwitz. Then they requested information from the prosecutor's office of the Federal Republic. The West Germans sent copies of the documents they had. The result was explosive. The anti-fascist state had among its citizens a selection doctor from Birkenau. In June 1965, the Stasi arrested Fischer, officially for an alleged traffic accident. In reality, it was an arrest for war crimes. He was transferred to the Hohenschönhausen prison in Berlin, where he spent months under interrogation. The investigators reconstructed his career in the SS. They asked him to draw plans of the camp, to explain the selection process, to detail figures. Fischer cooperated. He hoped that this cooperation would earn him a lesser sentence. The regime decided to turn his case into an exemplary trial. At the beginning of 1966, the proceedings began before the Supreme Court of the GDR. It was not a provincial court. It was the highest judicial instance in the country. Dozens of witnesses from different countries were presented, survivors who had seen Fischer on the ramp and in the infirmaries, historians and experts who explained the functioning of Auschwitz. The trial was partially broadcast and was covered by the official press. The GDR wanted to show the world that it was doing what, according to its narrative, the Federal Republic did not dare to do. During the proceedings, Fischer admitted the magnitude of the crime. He acknowledged that the system was planned, that the deportees were used as labor until exhaustion, that those who were not fit for work were sent to the gas. He tried to present himself as just another cog without personal initiative, but the judges focused on his personal role, his decisions on the ramp, his orders to subordinates, his reports to superiors. The court declared him guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced him to death. In July 1966, he was executed by guillotine in the Leipzig prison. The medical profession facing its past, universities, associations, and files. Already in 1946 and 1947, the doctor's trial in Nuremberg placed the profession under international scrutiny. 23 German doctors and administrators were tried for experiments on humans, forced sterilizations, and the euthanasia program against people with disabilities. 16 were convicted. From that process came the Nuremberg Code, with 10 principles on informed consent, risk, and protection of research subjects. However, that impact did not immediately translate into a deep change within German medicine. The Nuremberg Code was seen for years as something imposed from outside, intended for them, the criminals on trial, and not as a guide for everyday practice in clinics and universities. In the Federal Republic, many doctors continued to rely more on their own corporate tradition than on a code born from a military tribunal of occupation. The medical faculties reopened soon. They needed to train professionals for a destroyed country. The Allies pressured to remove the most visible Nazis, but they could not suddenly replace all the professors. In many cases, the universities changed the deans most compromised and kept a large part of the rest of the staff. Later studies show that the continuity was striking. Key chairs, such as psychiatry, pediatrics, genetics, or anatomy, continued to be directed by academics who had collaborated with racial policies, sterilizations, and euthanasia programs. Something similar occurred with the professional associations. Regional medical chambers and the national organization focused their discourse on rebuilding the prestige of the profession. They presented themselves as victims of Nazism, forced to obey political orders. For decades, there was hardly any talk about the active participation of thousands of doctors in deportations, patient selection, and experiments. Recent historical research describes that attitude as a hesitant dealing with their own past. In that climate, the individual files of the doctors of Auschwitz were diluted. If a doctor had not been convicted in Nuremberg, in the USSR, or in Poland, and if no patient denounced him, his record remained stored in some military or university archive that almost nobody consulted. The result was a kind of bureaucratic amnesia. There were documents, but there was no will to use them. From the 1960s onward, some factors began to move that inertia. On one hand, the major trials on Nazi crimes in the Federal Republic forced a review of old files. The prosecutors preparing the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt requested complete lists of the medical personnel of the camp. By crossing those data with civil and professional records, they discovered that many of those names were still active in clinics and universities. On the other hand, a new generation of students and young doctors began to ask uncomfortable questions. In seminars and conferences, some historians presented data about the enthusiasm with which German medicine had embraced racial ideology. They showed percentages of Nazi Party membership among faculty professors and the use of bodies of executed prisoners for the teaching of anatomy. That type of work, in which authors such as Volker Roelke have participated, dismantled the idea that only a few monsters had betrayed medical ethics. The institutional response was slow. In the 1970s and 1980s, some universities commissioned internal studies about their history during the Third Reich. Often, these reports remained within small academic circles. They did not translate into sanctions or into important symbolic changes. Commemorative plaques, names of halls or chairs continued honoring doctors who had participated in policies of extermination, while their full biographies appeared only in specialized articles. At the international level, however, the legacy of Nazi medical crimes became central for bioethics. The Nuremberg Code influenced the Declaration of Helsinki of the World Medical Association and the creation of ethics committees in hospitals and universities. In conferences on human rights and medicine, Auschwitz was often cited as the ultimate example of what happens when science bends to state ideology and dehumanization. Within Germany, the official recognition of the role of the profession took much longer. It was not until 2012 when the National Medical Association issued a formal apology for the atrocities of doctors during Nazism. In that declaration, it was recognized that it was not a matter of a few isolated cases, but of a broad, voluntary and organized involvement of the profession as a whole. Articles in international medical journals highlighted that this apology arrived decades late. That delay becomes even clearer when the timelines are compared. While researchers from other countries discussed the meaning of the Nuremberg Code and placed it at the center of the teaching of medical ethics, many German faculties barely included the subject in their curricula. Only in recent years have specific modules on medicine and the Holocaust been developed in some universities. The Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt and the return of the forbidden names. When in December 1963, the first major trial about Auschwitz opened in Frankfurt, almost 20 years had passed since the end of the war. It was not an international tribunal nor an allied military court. It was a criminal court of the Federal Republic of Germany. On the bench were not the highest leaders, but 22 former members of the camp garrison, middle-ranking and lower-level personnel accused of murder and complicity in murder according to the German Penal Code. The main driving force behind these trials was the Attorney General of the Land of Hesse, Fritz Bauer. Jewish, social democrat, exiled during Nazism, he had returned to Germany determined to use criminal law to force society to look at its own crimes. He had already had a key role in the capture of Adolf Eichmann. Now he wanted something different. It was not only about punishing a few, it was about showing that the normal functioning of Auschwitz involved hundreds of people. Bauer insisted that the case be instructed in Frankfurt. He gathered complaints, testimonies, and files scattered across several prosecutors' offices. He managed to have a collective charge admitted for murders committed in the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. He also ensured that the trial would take place publicly, with the presence of journalists and international observers. He wanted the process to have a pedagogical effect, that Germans would hear, in their own language and before their own judges, what had happened in Eastern Europe. The accused were a sample of the ordinary personnel of the camp. There were former members of the staff headquarters, block leaders, labor foremen, a prisoner registrar, and also medical personnel. Among the latter, the case of Franz Lucas stood out, an SS doctor accused of participating in selections on the Birkenau ramp. His defense tried to present him as someone who had resisted carrying out criminal orders. The testimonies of survivors placed him, however, pointing with his hand to those who went directly to the gas chambers. The process developed in several phases between 1963 and 1965. The courtroom became the stage of a confrontation between memory and denial. Week after week, survivors from different countries recounted, before German judges and lawyers, the scenes of the arrival of transports, the selections, the punishments, the gas trials. They recognized the accused, described gestures, remembered phrases. For many, it was the first time they spoke in public in such detail. The doctors had an uncomfortable place in that narrative. They were not presented as abstract scientists, but as concrete figures who had been seen on the ramp, in the infirmaries, or in the crematoria. Some defended themselves by saying that they had never had decision-making power, that they only obeyed orders from chief doctors already dead or judged in other processes. Others tried to demonstrate that they had helped from within the system to save lives. It was the same strategy that years earlier had allowed Hans Munch to be acquitted in Krakow, and his shadow hovered over the courtroom. The tribunal did not easily accept those lines of defense. The prosecution, supported by the work of Bauer and his team, insisted that Auschwitz could not be understood as a simple hierarchical structure where only those at the top were responsible. Every doctor who participated in a selection, every signature on a falsified death certificate, every injection of phenol into the heart of a prisoner implied an individual decision. Even those who had not designed the genocidal policy had contributed to applying it. In the middle of the trial, Bauer's figure became even more exposed. He received threats, hate letters, and political pressure. Conservative sectors accused him of opening old wounds and of damaging the country's image. He replied that those wounds had never been closed. His objective was not only to obtain convictions, but to establish an exhaustive judicial record on the functioning of the camp. That documentation would serve as a basis for future trials and for historical research. In August 1965, the first sentences were delivered. Several defendants were sentenced to life imprisonment for murder, others to prison terms for complicity, and some were acquitted for lack of direct evidence. From outside, the sentences seemed modest compared to the magnitude of the crimes. However, the social effect was profound. For the first time, broad layers of German public opinion heard the names of blocks, descriptions of ramps, and accounts of gas chambers, not as enemy propaganda, but as facts established in a German courtroom. For the doctors of Auschwitz, who were still free, the trial had an ambiguous impact. On one hand, it showed that the myth of "I knew nothing" was beginning to crack. From Frankfurt onward, it became more difficult to maintain that the medical service of the camp had been a simple sanitary department in the middle of chaos. On the other hand, the limited number of defendants and the complexity of proving concrete responsibilities meant that many professionals with a past in camps never reached the bench. Their daily life in offices and universities continued, although with a growing sense of fragility. On the international level, the echo of the process reinforced the idea that justice for Nazi crimes had not closed in Nuremberg. It demonstrated that national courts could and should deal with crimes committed by their own citizens. It also gave visibility to the figure of the prosecutor who confronts his own institutions, like Bauer, who paid a high personal price for his determination and died in 1968 without seeing the long wave of his work fully unfold. Last decades, interviews, denials, and encounters with the victims. In the 1970s and 1980s, many doctors connected to Auschwitz were no longer in active practices or operating rooms. They were older men, retired, living on pensions or accumulated savings. Justice had reached some of them, others had died without sentencing. A large group remained free, with fragmented biographies in judicial archives and names beginning to emerge from anonymity thanks to journalists, young prosecutors, and survivor associations. In those years, the social climate changed. The generation born after the war began to ask out loud what their parents had done during Nazism. Films and series about the camps were released. Memoirs of survivors were published that reached a wide audience. The image of Nazism ceased to be an almost taboo topic in many German and European families. This shift in awareness also affected the doctors who had worked in Auschwitz. Some began receiving letters, interview requests, late judicial summonses. One of the names that had the most public presence was Hans Munch. After his acquittal in Krakow, he had led an apparently quiet life for decades as a rural doctor in Bavaria. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, journalists and researchers sought him out to ask about the operation of the camp. His statements mixed partial acknowledgement and self-exculpation. He accepted the existence of gas chambers. He recognized the magnitude of the murder. At the same time, he presented himself as someone who had saved prisoners when possible. In 1995, during a commemorative ceremony organized by survivors, he signed a declaration in which he confirmed in writing that gas chambers had been used in Auschwitz to kill human beings. That document was used by activists and educators as a direct response to denialist discourse growing in some circles. However, later historical studies questioned Munch's image as a moral exception. They noted contradictions between his recollections and those of other witnesses and emphasized that even if he did not participate in certain tasks, he was part of a medical structure that facilitated selections and experiments. Other doctors opted for silence. Some refused interviews, hung up the phone when Auschwitz was mentioned, or responded through lawyers. On certain occasions, reporters located former doctors living in residential neighborhoods or small towns, filmed them leaving supermarkets or at their doorsteps, and read excerpts of testimonies against them. The scenes repeated. General denial, short phrases about being just soldiers or military doctors, refusal to answer on camera. There were also cases in which justice intervened again. From the 1980s onward, German prosecutors reopened investigations on crimes in extermination camps. New complaints, better access to archives in Eastern Europe, and a different reading of criminal law allowed in some cases taking people to the bench who until then had been considered minor accomplices. These were not always major figures. Sometimes they were mid-level doctors, responsible for infirmaries or women's blocks, whose concrete activity could be reconstructed thanks to late files and testimonies preserved for decades. For the victims, these late encounters carried special weight. Survivors who had spent much of their lives in Israel, the United States, or Latin America traveled to Germany to testify against elderly doctors. In the courtroom, they faced men who no longer had the threatening appearance of an SS officer. They were grandfathers with canes, thick glasses, and trembling voices. That physical distance did not diminish the gravity of the acts discussed. On the contrary, it made the time elapsed between the crime and the possibility of justice more visible. In some cases, victims met face-to-face with the doctors outside a judicial context. Visits to former towns, encounters organized by memory projects, documentary filming. There were scenes in which a person who had undergone medical experiments in the camp sat across from a former doctor to ask why he had done it. The answers ranged from complete denial to technical explanation, including attempts to justify the actions as system pressure or wartime context. The media landscape also changed the place these doctors occupied in public memory. Television documentaries included reconstructions of their biographies. Investigative journalism books traced them from the 1940s to old age. In some countries, these works became references for understanding how the post-war period allowed camp criminals to live for decades without conviction. In others, their impact was smaller, but they contributed to a general climate in which the role of doctors in the genocide ceased to be an issue exclusive to specialists. At the same time, a specific ethical discussion arose about the scientific information generated in the camps. Part of the post-war medical literature included data coming directly or indirectly from Nazi experiments. Debate arose over whether it was legitimate to use these results, even citing them as a negative example. Many ethics committees and professional associations concluded that the criminal origin invalidated them as a legitimate reference, beyond their possible technical value. The debate showed that the hidden life of Auschwitz doctors was not limited to their personal biographies. It was also present in practices, tables, and data that had circulated for years without a thorough review of their origin. In the last decades of the 20th century and the early 21st, the number of living doctors who had worked at Auschwitz dwindled almost to zero. The issue ceased to be whether they would be judged and shifted to what to do with their legacy. How to teach their history in medical schools, how to integrate their names into memorials and museums, how to respond to discourses that attempted to minimize their responsibility or dilute it into an abstract collective guilt. Heritage and ethics, what the hidden life of these doctors left to the 21st century. In the last decades of the 20th century, the history of camp doctors ceased to be solely a matter of criminal justice. It became a problem of professional ethics. It was no longer only a question of who had been convicted or who had escaped. The issue was different: what to do with a medical tradition that had produced Auschwitz, and how to prevent something similar from happening again. The first major milestone was the Nuremberg Code. It was created in 1947 as part of the judgment of the doctor's trial. It was not a philosophical treatise. It was a list of 10 principles for experiments on human beings drafted by military judges who had just heard weeks of testimony about medical crimes. Its starting point was radical. The voluntary consent of the subject is absolutely essential. No coercion, no deception, no taking advantage of a situation of dependency. Furthermore, the code required that risks be proportional to potential benefits, that all unnecessary suffering be avoided, and that the subject could withdraw from the experiment at any time. For years, however, that text had little impact on everyday practice. In many countries, it was seen as a code for them, the criminals tried at Nuremberg, and not as a guide for us, ordinary doctors. Important professional associations ignored it or considered it too rigid. The history of clinical research in the 1950s and 1960s shows trials with serious deficiencies in patient information, even outside Germany. The situation began to change when the international medical community developed its own framework. In 1964, the World Medical Association adopted a specific declaration on human research in Helsinki. It was not a legal text, it was a statement by the doctors themselves. The Declaration of Helsinki picked up the logic of Nuremberg, linked it to the professional oath, and adapted it to the reality of modern clinical research. It emphasized the need for prior laboratory and animal studies, careful assessment of risks and benefits, and enhanced protection for vulnerable individuals. The declaration was revised several times in subsequent decades, becoming one of the pillars of research ethics worldwide. In parallel, other documents completed the framework. Reports such as the Belmont Report in the United States or guidelines from the World Health Organization defined principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice in the selection of subjects. In practice, this translated into the creation of ethics committees in hospitals and universities. No serious clinical trial could begin without the review of an independent body responsible for ensuring the dignity and safety of participants. The shadow of Nazi crimes was present in many of these debates, even if not always explicitly mentioned. Within Germany, the process was slower and more painful. For decades, many faculties and medical associations avoided confronting their own role in Nazism. Historical research advanced faster than institutional gestures. Books and articles showed the massive involvement of doctors in euthanasia programs, forced sterilizations, and experiments in the camps. Professional organizations, on the other hand, limited themselves to recognizing errors of the past without naming responsible individuals or structures. The symbolic shift came only in 2012. That year, the German Medical Association approved a formal apology in Nuremberg. It recognized that many doctors had been guilty, contrary to their mission to heal, of serious violations of human rights. It admitted that these were not a few isolated deviants, but a broad participation of the profession in murders, experiments, and extermination programs. The declaration apologized to the victims, living and dead, and to their descendants. Articles in medical journals emphasized that the apology was important, but also very late. That gesture did not close the matter. It displaced it. From then on, the focus shifted even more toward teaching and internal memory of the profession. Some faculties incorporated specific courses on medicine and the Holocaust. Names of halls, chairs, and awards honoring doctors involved in crimes were reviewed. Research projects on the past of hospitals, clinics, and associations were promoted. Each new study expanded the map. It was not only about the major names, like the Auschwitz doctors, but entire networks that had collaborated with the regime. The dynamic also reached other health sectors. In 2025, for example, the Professional Society of German Dentists held for the first time a memorial event recognizing the systematic involvement of dentistry in Nazi crimes, from forced extractions to experiments and gold thefts from living and dead prisoners. The ceremony relied on recent research showing very high percentages of Nazi party affiliation among academic dentists and concentration camps where they directly participated in killings. These types of gestures indicate that the process of reviewing professional responsibility is still ongoing, more than 80 years after the end of the regime. In parallel, a specific debate developed about the use of data obtained through medical crimes. Some Nazi experiments produced tables and curves on hypothermia, altitude, or toxicity. For years, certain technical manuals cited them indirectly. From the 1980s onward, ethics committees and bioethics experts began asking whether those results should continue to circulate. Many concluded that legitimizing their use would give scientific value to acts that were, in essence, torture. Others argued that hiding them did not change the past and that they could at least serve as a warning. The majority consensus was that they had no place in modern clinical practice and that if mentioned, it should be only in historical and critical contexts. Today, when medical ethics is taught in many universities, Auschwitz appears as a boundary case, not only as an example of extreme violation of norms, but as a warning about how an entire profession can go astray when mixed with exclusionary ideologies and power structures that reward obedience above conscience. The current emphasis on informed consent, protection of vulnerable people, transparency in clinical trials, and independence of ethics committees cannot be fully understood without that prior history of mass abuse. The later life of the Auschwitz doctors is therefore intertwined with that evolution. Some died in Soviet or German prisons, others lived for decades as respected clinicians. Others hid in South America and escaped any court. What happened to them after 1945 influenced how justice was conceived, how ethics codes were designed, and the pace at which institutions decided to recognize their own responsibility. Every time a researcher submits a protocol to an ethics committee, every time a patient signs informed consent after receiving clear explanations, there is an echo of that history. Behind these current practices are the victims who could not choose, the prisoners used as laboratory material, and the doctors who turned their knowledge into an instrument of murder. Remembering the hidden life of these doctors is not only about reconstructing biographies. It is about keeping visible a boundary that medicine crossed once and that today is being carefully avoided.